The list is still there, sitting quietly on your phone, on a sticky note, or just inside your head, waiting. A few things crossed out, more things not. And somehow, at the end of the day, it isn't the crossed out lines you remember. It's the ones still untouched. The ones that followed you through every hour, every meal, every moment you almost relaxed, but didn't. The strange part isn't that the list is unfinished. The strange part is how personal it feels. Like the unfinished tasks aren't just undone work. They're proof of something about you. So here's the question worth sitting with. When did a simple list stop being a tool and start feeling like a verdict? For most of human history, time was not something people managed. It was something they moved with. A farmer woke when the sky changed color. He worked until the light disappeared. He rested when the body asked him to. There was no plan written on paper, no list of tasks to complete before sunset. The day had a natural shape, and he simply lived inside that shape. Time was not a resource. It was just the rhythm of being alive. This is not a romantic idea. Life was hard, uncertain, and often short, but there was one thing that did not exist: the feeling that you were behind. That feeling, the quiet anxiety of not doing enough, is surprisingly new. It was born in the Industrial Revolution in the factories of 18th and 19th century England. For the first time, human labor was measured not by what was produced, but by how many hours were spent. Workers clocked in and clocked out. Time became something that could be bought and sold. And if time could be bought and sold, then wasted time was wasted money. Factory owners needed workers to be efficient, predictable, accountable. So they created schedules, deadlines, output targets. The human body was, in many ways, treated like a machine, one that should always be running at full capacity. This was not a personal philosophy, it was an industrial system, but systems have a way of moving beyond the walls that built them. By the late 1800s, the logic of the factory had begun to enter private life. Frederick Winslow Taylor, an American engineer, published ideas about scientific management, arguing that every task, even simple ones, could be broken down, timed, and optimized. His work was designed for factories, but people read it and began to apply it to themselves. The idea was seductive. If you organize your time perfectly, you will get more done. And if you get more done, you will become more successful, more valuable, more real. Somehow, this was the moment a tool became a belief. The to-do list in its earliest forms was simply a memory aid, a way to avoid forgetting things. But once efficiency became a moral value, the list quietly changed its meaning. It was no longer just what you need to do, it became what you owe the day, what you owe yourself, what you owe the invisible standard that was slowly forming in the culture around you. A factory worker in 1850 was measured by his output because someone else demanded it. But by the early 20th century, people had begun to measure themselves, willingly, privately, almost devotedly, by the same standard. No one forced them to. That's what made it so powerful. The pressure didn't come from outside anymore. It moved inward. And once something moves inward, it stops feeling like a system. It starts feeling like the truth. Once the logic of efficiency moved inside a person, it needed a home. And slowly, steadily, the self-help industry built one. The 20th century became the century of personal productivity. Books arrived with promises printed on their covers. Systems were designed, named, and sold. Time management became a skill you could learn, and more importantly, a skill you could fail at. The message underneath was always the same. Your life is a project, and the right method will help you run it better. Some of these systems were genuinely useful. They helped people feel less overwhelmed, more focused. That part was real. But something else was happening at the same time. Quietly, in the background, each new system, each planner, each method, each framework carried an assumption inside it. The assumption was this: your natural way of moving through the day is not enough. You need a structure. You need categories, priorities, time blocks. You need, in other words, to be optimized. In 1967, a time management researcher named Alan Lakin popularized the idea of sorting tasks by importance, labeling them A, B, or C. It sounds simple, even obvious now, but the cultural effect was significant. It suggested that the way you spend each hour should be consciously ranked, that some hours are more valuable than others, that an unranked hour is, in some sense, a wasted one. The planner became the new confessional. At the end of each week, you looked at the page and saw exactly where you had succeeded and where you had fallen short. Think of someone sitting at a desk on a Sunday evening, carefully writing out the week ahead. Color-coded. Teamed. Every hour assigned a purpose. There is something that feels productive about this moment, before the week even begins. A feeling of control, of readiness. But notice what is also happening. The week, which has not yet arrived, is already being judged, already being held to a standard it may not meet. The list is written in the future, but the anxiety it carries is already present, already real. This is how a tool becomes a system, and how a system becomes a mindset. By the time productivity culture entered the digital age, the transformation was complete. Apps replaced paper planners. Notifications replaced alarm clocks. The system was now always on, always watching, always ready to remind you of what remained undone. And the people using these tools were no longer just trying to remember things. They were trying to become something. The organized person. The disciplined person. The person who had, finally, figured out how to use time correctly. Efficiency had traveled a long road, from the factory floor, through the business world, into the bedroom, into the mind. And at every step of that journey, the message grew quieter, more personal, more deeply embedded. Your value is connected to what you produce. Your worth can be measured. And the list, always the list, will tell you how you're doing. Here is something nobody tells you when they hand you a productivity system. The list is designed to never be finished. Not because you are lazy, not because you are disorganized, but because of something built into the nature of the list itself. Every time you complete a task, the space it leaves behind feels like an invitation to add something new, something more, something you had been putting off. The list doesn't shrink, it breathes. It expands to fill whatever time you give it, and so the finish line keeps moving. You cross off 3 things. You add 5. You wake up the next morning, and the list is longer than yesterday, even though you worked all day. There is a word for this feeling, but most people don't reach for a word. They reach for a reason, and the reason they find is usually themselves. I wasn't focused enough. I wasn't disciplined enough. I didn't wake up early enough. I wasted too much time. This is the moment the list stops being a tool and becomes something else entirely. It becomes a mirror, and the reflection it shows is not neutral. A woman finishes a full day of work, meetings attended, emails answered, a difficult conversation handled with care. She sits down in the evening and looks at her list. More than half of it remains untouched, not because she was idle, because the day was full of things that don't appear on any list: the unexpected phone call, the colleague who needed help, the hour lost to a problem nobody planned for. But the list doesn't know any of that. The list only shows what wasn't done. And somehow, without deciding to, she absorbs that image. The incomplete list becomes an incomplete self. This is the hidden cost that no productivity book mentions, not because the authors are dishonest, but because the system was never designed to account for it. The system was built on the assumption that a human being is a rational, consistent, optimizable unit. That with the right structure, output will increase and satisfaction will follow. What it didn't account for was feeling. The way a person carries their list not just in their pocket, but in their chest. The way an unfinished task at midnight feels heavier than it did at noon. The way the word productive has quietly become a synonym for worthy. And this is where the pressure becomes something more than stress. It becomes identity. When the list is going well, you feel capable, purposeful, real, in some way that's hard to explain but easy to feel. And when the list falls apart, when the day took a different shape than you planned, something smaller and darker arrives. Not just frustration, something closer to shame. That shift, from tool to judge to mirror, happened so gradually that most people never noticed it. They just woke up one day and realized they hadn't felt truly rested in a very long time. And somehow, there was still more to do. At some point, the pressure stopped feeling like pressure. It just started feeling like life. That is what happens when a belief becomes a culture. It disappears into the background, into the air, into the conversations. into the quiet assumptions people carry without ever examining them. And somewhere in the last 2 decades, the belief that busyness equals value stopped being a personal struggle and became a shared atmosphere, something everyone breathed together without noticing. The modern productivity industry is worth over $80 billion globally. That number is not just a fact about money, it is a fact about how deeply people believe they need fixing, about how many millions of people wake up every morning convinced that if they could only find the right system, the right app, the right morning routine, they would finally feel like enough. Social media accelerated this in ways that are still difficult to fully measure. Platforms filled with people documenting their 5 a.m. routines, their weekly reviews, their deep work sessions, their color-coded calendars. The message was framed as inspiration, but underneath the clean aesthetics and soft morning light, a comparison was always present. Look how much they do. Look how little you do. A young man, early in his career, begins following productivity accounts online. At first it feels motivating. He downloads the apps, builds the systems, restructures his mornings. For a few weeks, he feels sharp, focused, ahead. Then the system starts to slip. A late night here, a skipped review there, and something unexpected happens. He doesn't just feel disorganized, he feels like he has failed the version of himself he was supposed to become. The tools that promise freedom quietly became a new set of obligations. This is the normalization that makes modern productivity culture so difficult to step back from. Rest in this system is not a natural part of being human. It is a reward, something that must be earned through sufficient output. You can relax, but only after the list is done. You can sleep, but only if you feel you deserved it. Leisure is permitted, but only as recovery, a way to recharge so that tomorrow you can produce again. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han described modern society as an achievement society, a world where people are no longer oppressed by others, but by themselves, where the harshest demands come not from a boss or a system, but from the internal voice that says more, faster, better. What makes this particularly difficult is that it wears the clothing of self-improvement. It looks like ambition. It sounds like discipline. It feels, on good days, like purpose. So people don't resist it, they refine it. They search for a better app, a better method, a better version of the system that will finally make the feeling stop. But the feeling doesn't stop. Because the feeling was never about the system, it was always about something older, quieter, and much harder to put on a list. Let's stay with that feeling for a moment. The one underneath the list. Underneath the apps and the routines and the carefully structured mornings. If you remove all the systems, if you take away the planner, close the productivity app, put down the pen, what is actually there? For many people, the honest answer is uncomfortable. Uncertainty. Stillness. A silence that asks questions the busy mind never has to face. Questions like, what do I actually want? Not what do I need to finish, but what do I want my life to feel like? And the harder one, if I stopped measuring myself, would I still feel real? This is what the list, at its deepest level, protects us from. Not chaos, not failure, but the open, unstructured space where we would have to meet ourselves without anything to show. Busyness has always been partly a philosophical escape. If every hour is accounted for, there's no hour left for doubt. If the list is long enough, there is no silence long enough to ask whether the list is pointing in the right direction. Productivity becomes not just a habit, but a way of avoiding the one question that no system can answer. Is this the life I actually chose? The ancient Stoics had a practice they called memento mori, a quiet, deliberate reminder that life is finite. Not to create despair, but to create clarity. Because when you hold the shortness of life in your hands, the triviality of certain tasks becomes obvious, and the things that actually matter, presence, connection, meaning, move into sharper focus. A life, they understood, is not a project to be optimized. It is an experience to be inhabited. This doesn't mean lists are wrong. It doesn't mean ambition is a trap or that structure has no value. Some people genuinely thrive with organization. Some tasks genuinely need to be tracked. The list, as a simple tool, is innocent. What is worth examining is the belief attached to it. The belief that a completed list makes you a complete person. That a productive day justifies your existence. That rest is something you earn rather than something you are allowed. Simply because you are alive and you are tired, You are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to reach the end of a day with things unfinished and still decide, quietly, without guilt, that the day was enough. That you were enough, not because you crossed everything off, but because you moved through the hours as honestly as you could with the energy you actually had and the life you were actually living. The unfinished list will be there tomorrow. It is almost always there tomorrow. But so will you. And that, if you let yourself feel it, is not a small thing. The pressure of the list is real. But it was never really about time. It was always about the fear that without proof of effort, without evidence of output, without something to show, you might not be enough. You are enough. The list just never had the ability to tell you that. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.